Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. The big story for the last 2 days has been India-Pakistan relations, Pakistan's response in particular to the Pathankot terror attack, and what impact that would have on the scheduled India-Pakistan Foreign Secretary level talks. After reports yesterday evening that Masood Azhar, his brother and brother-in-law had been detained, were not confirmed today by the Pakistan Foreign Office or the foreign government itself. The Indian government has decided to reschedule the talks, and they will now happen in the very near future. With me to talk about the entire gamut of developments which over the last 2 days have kept audiences both in Pakistan and in India entranced and completely sitting in front of the television screen is Pakistan's former ambassador to the United States, an author who's written extensively on civilian and military relations in his country, and now is the director with the Hudson Institute in Washington, Hussain Haqqani. Mr. Haqqani, let's start with the decision announced this evening on a mutually agreed basis to reschedule the Foreign Secretary talks to the very near future. How do you respond to that?
I would say that holding of talks is not a prize, and withholding it is not punishment. This is symbolic. Postponing it a little bit is important for the Indian side to feel comfortable that Pakistan is taking the steps it's telling them that it is taking. For the Pakistani side, it saves face because Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has invested heavily in trying to normalize relations with India. But what we are seeing actually is a remake of an old movie. And what we have to see is, while this may be a nice turn or a twist in the plot for the day, will we be able to improve on the script for the finale?
I'll come to that in a moment's time. But yesterday on this show, former Pakistani High Commissioners to India, like Ashraf Qazi and Aziz Ahmed Khan, were saying that a postponement, even of a few days, would be unfortunate, it would be demoralizing. Now that it's happened, do you think in the circumstances it's understandable, or do you agree with them it's unfortunate?
I think that sometimes meetings are postponed. I think holding of the meetings should not be seen as an end in itself. India and Pakistan are nuclear armed neighbors. They need to talk to each other. The Soviet Union and the United States talked to each other through the Cuban Missile Crisis and way beyond. So I think that the talks should not be made the real object of our analysis and discussion. And my former colleagues who said that this was so important, I think that they exaggerate the value and the importance of these talks. We've had several rounds of foreign secretary talks in the past. We really need to have a great leap forward, and I don't see that happening.
Now, in the background behind the decision this evening to postpone the talks to the very near future was the question, what's happened or what hasn't happened to Masood Azhar, his brother Rauf Asghar, his brother-in-law Ashfaq Ahmed. Yesterday evening, reports from GeoTV, but also reports sourced to unnamed Pakistani government sources, said that these gentlemen had been detained. And those reports are all over the front pages of Pakistan's papers today. But today, the Pakistan Foreign Office and the government refused to confirm those reports. What do you make of that refusal to confirm something the Pakistan press believes is true?
Well, I think what they want to do is create the impression that they are taking action, and at the same time keep the option open for saying later we don't have enough evidence and therefore we can't hold this person forever. Remember, Masood Azhar was also taken into custody after returning to Pakistan, and he returned to Pakistan from an Indian prison as a result of a hijacking. Now, when he came back, he organized Jaish-e-Mohammed. No one stopped him. And even now, yesterday I found it very funny that my government was telling the world that there had been raids on the offices of Jaish-e-Mohammed, an organization that my government has banned 13 years ago.
Absolutely. But for a moment, sticking to this news that, or the reports rather, that Masood Azhar, his brother and brother-in-law have been detained, do you believe those reports, widely on the front pages of your country's papers, are accurate? Or do you agree with some Indians who suspect they are plants and deliberately designed to create a misleading impression in India?
Well, I'm not sure about the latter, the Indian position that this is deliberate. I do not know what's happening. I'm not in the country. As far as what appears on the Pakistani press is concerned, look, there can be many things that are said very, very definitively in the press, but they don't really pan out. The important thing is...
So it's possible the reports are inaccurate and wrong?
Both possibilities exist. The possibility that the reports are inaccurate, or there is partial truth in them, that these gentlemen have been taken into custody by the intelligence services, but they have been taken into custody only to talk to them, not necessarily to charge them or take them to court.
To be honest, the language used by the Pakistani authorities who've spoken is protective custody, not arrest. Most journalists have translated protective custody to mean arrest. You're saying protective custody is more likely than arrest.
Protective custody, detention, these are different from arrest. Arrest always involves charging somebody with a specific crime. That has been the problem with India-centric terrorist groups all along. Musharraf announced after 9/11 that he would take action against all terrorist groups, and many people believed him all over the world. We found that there were two exceptions: Afghan-centric groups and India-centric groups. And as a Pakistani, let me add that most Pakistanis would like action against all groups, because when they are not attacking India, they are attacking Pakistanis. Jaish-e-Mohammed has been involved in attacks inside Pakistan too.
In this instance, on the assumption that the reports that they've been taken into protective custody are accurate, it would then mean that this happened after 3 meetings held by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, that the army and the ISI are supportive of whatever action has been taken against Azhar, his brother and brother-in-law, that it's happened with their concurrence and with their agreement?
Karan, you might recall that President Zardari, soon after his election in 2008, was talking to you, I believe, when he said that Pakistan would consider changing its position on nuclear weapons, and that it would take a stance different than it had taken in the past about no first use. Soon after that, we saw the attack in Mumbai. After Mumbai, similar meetings were held between the top leadership. Now, I'm not saying that there is anything wrong with the Prime Minister consulting with the army chief or consulting with the intelligence chief, but the way it is given prominence in Pakistan makes it very clear that the Prime Minister does not have full executive authority as is vested in him and his office by the Constitution of Pakistan, and that disturbs me.
So what you're suggesting is the mere fact that he had to repeatedly consult the army chief and the ISI chief may also possibly mean that they are in agreement with whatever he's done against Azhar, but it does also underline the fact that he's not an independent authority. In a sense, he works under them, they don't work under him.
Well, or they could actually be two parallel centers of authority and power.
Now, as you said, Azhar has been detained before. It happened to begin with immediately after the attack on the Indian Parliament by the Jaish in 2001. On that occasion, he was released by the Lahore High Court without ever being prosecuted. Much the same, at least twice, has happened with Hafiz Saeed. Could history, assuming Azhar has been detained, repeat itself? In other words, you have detention followed by release without any prosecution.
It is perfectly possible. Look, let me say that Pakistan does have a complex reality. We have all these armed groups. The word Jaish means army. It's the army of Muhammad. Similarly, Lashkar-e-Taiba means army of the pure. And then Pakistan has the real army, the trained army that is constitutionally mandated and that is supposedly officially and properly organized. Why do we have these illicit armies in our country? And they can't exist unless and until somebody says we need them for other purposes. 13 years is long enough to locate the Jaish-e-Mohammed officers and shut them down forever. That wasn't done.
I want to pick up on what you're saying, because a moment ago you referred to one of the peculiarities of the Jaish-e-Mohammed. As you pointed out, it was banned in 2003-2004 when it was said to be involved in an assassination attempt against General Musharraf. How then is it functioning 11, 12, 13 years later, openly and freely? And secondly, why is the government now involved in sealing its offices when they shouldn't have been open in the first place to begin with?
Absolutely, Karan, and that's the question I ask as a Pakistani and get very sort of attacked and abused by some of my countrymen who really think that those who attack neighboring countries are not necessarily bad people. Look, whether an attack takes place in Pathankot or Mumbai, or it takes place in Peshawar and Karachi, it's a terrorist attack. Pakistan is committed to fighting terrorism by virtue of its membership of the United Nations. We can't hide behind there is no evidence forever. Look, immediately before 9/11, you might recall, Pakistan was saying the same thing about Osama bin Laden. When the Americans asked that Osama bin Laden be found in Afghanistan, everybody knew he was there. Pakistan said, give us evidence. When they don't need evidence, they can charge people and keep them in prison for a long time. All the Al-Qaeda people were arrested on evidence provided by the United States. It wasn't Pakistani
The
evidence.
opposite is also true. They could have evidence and ignore it and keep the man a free person, even though the person concerned should be arrested and charged.
Absolutely, but my point is that when the United States provides evidence, that evidence is accepted by us. When India provides the evidence, why do we reject it? We should act upon it like all other members of the UN do in dealing with terrorism.
Now, of course, the interesting thing, and you're not saying it openly, but clearly anyone who understands Pakistan would realize this is what you suggest. The Jaish operates with the protection, possibly even at the behest of the Pakistan army. A couple of hours before news reports came yesterday that Masood Azhar, his brother and brother-in-law, had been detained, the Indian army chief at a public press conference said that he agreed the Pakistan Army had repeatedly derailed talks with India. The question I want to ask is this: what exactly is the relationship between the Jaish and the Pakistan Army? And secondly, in Pathankot, was the Jaish acting at the behest of the army? And now, if reports that Azhar and his brother have been arrested are accurate, has the army distanced itself, or is it just a facade?
Look, first of all, let us understand the Pakistan Army after Musharraf seems to have taken an institutional decision that it's not going to directly assume power. So because of that, they have to defer to the elected leaders to some extent, work with them, and then try to use other instruments of influence. The media, for example, protests in the streets by different groups, etc. So that is the reality that is going on in the relationship. But the Pakistan Army has changed. It did realize after the attack on the Army Public School that Pakistan is also under attack. 60,000 Pakistanis have died in terrorist attacks.
That's December 2014.
Absolutely. But even then, there is a reluctance. Now look, I have actually considerable admiration for General Raheel Sharif. He has accomplished something that General Musharraf and General Kiani could not do. He also seems to be a straightforward soldier rather than a complex political individual.
You're talking about Zarb-e-Azab.
But when he started Zarb-e-Azab, it was very directed, very specific. There has been no equivalent operation for groups located in Muridke and Bhawalpur and Karachi, and that is why this
Those are the groups that operate against India.
Those are the groups that have been found operating against India. LET is located in Muridke. Jaish-e-Mohammed is located in Karachi and Bhawalpur.
Hence my question, what is the relationship between the Jaish and the Pakistan Army?
Well, it is quite obvious that there are people in Pakistan, within the army, outside even, who think that having these groups is useful. It serves a useful purpose. Whereas people like me would argue that you simply cannot hold a live coal in your hand and expect not to be burned.
But then in the case of the Pathankot terror attack, do you believe the Jaish was acting at the behest of the army?
I have no reason to believe one way or the other. All I would say is that if they acted without anybody's approval and authorization and acted alone, then they are criminals of the state whom the state should take to deal with firmly. But if they did it at the behest of some institution in Pakistan, then that too needs to be investigated, and it needs to be investigated for the sake of Pakistan, not for the sake of good relations.
That means that you need to investigate the role the army plays in supporting, encouraging, funding, financing or protecting Jaish, and that, I presume, is unlikely to ever happen.
Well, you know that I wrote the book on Pakistan, the book Pakistan Between Mosque and Military, basically tells all about the institutional connections between various groups and the Pakistani military. The Pakistani military has snapped ties with some of the groups, but it is quite obvious that certain groups continue to thrive.
Absolutely, and amongst the groups that continue to thrive, and certainly this is a group that has come back into favor with the army, or so people in India believe in the last 1 year, is the Jaish-e-Mohammed. So now if it's accurate and true that the Jaish leader, his brother and brother-in-law have been either arrested or at least taken into protective custody, does that mean the army has backed away from what they did in Pathankot, or does it mean that Jaish acted without the army knowing and therefore the army is angry?
Well, we will find out the answer to that question in the days to come. It could be either one. But in case of Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, it's not just the army that is to be blamed. Pakistan's civilian leaders too need to account for their actions. Punjab, which is where Jaish-e-Mohammed operates out of, that is where LET operates out of, that province has been ruled by the Prime Minister's party, and his brother has been Chief Minister. The police is often a very good instrument when it comes to finding people who are doing unusual things in a small village or a small town. The fact that despite all that information being available, no action was taken against these people before they executed an attack inside India and almost brought the relationship back to the brink again after a high point of Prime Minister Modi coming to Lahore, basically means that a lot more change is required.
But now you're hinting, and in fact you're going more than just to hint, that there is a certain element of complicity between the PMLN, which is Nawaz Sharif and Shahbaz Sharif's party, and the fact that they have turned a blind eye, worse, or perhaps even permitted the Jaish to carry on its anti-India activities from Pakistan. You're suggesting that there's an element of complicity there, or at least there are questions PMLN has to answer.
Well, basically almost all major actors in Pakistan have to answer questions. Look, we have taken a very lackadaisical attitude towards terrorism. When people cheer an attack in India or in Afghanistan, I really shudder, because the same terrorists or their kin attack people in Pakistan. Jaish-e-Mohammed attacked Christians in Pakistan. Jaish-e-Mohammed has been involved in attacks on Ahmadis in Pakistan. So we should not be lenient towards any such group. It's time to make Pakistan a state that is responsive to its own people and is run by laws rather than by this kind of attitude.
As Hillary Clinton said, you can't rear a serpent in your back garden and hope never to be bitten by the thing.
Actually, she used the plural. She said snakes rather than just one serpent, because there are many, many snakes.
Absolutely. But to come back to the army, the second key question is, how does the army view Mr. Modi's surprise Christmas Day visit to Lahore to wish Nawaz Sharif happy birthday? 2 or 3 days ago, writing in the Pakistani newspaper Dawn, Ashraf Qazi, a former High Commissioner to India and a former ambassador to America just before you, actually raised the following question. He said, it is not yet clear what our military's attitude was to Modi's stopover in Lahore. What do you believe is the army's attitude to that gesture by Mr. Modi?
Look, I have heard that the Pakistan Army Chief, during his recent visit to Washington, D.C., told a group of think tank academics that the Pakistan Army is averse to normalization of relations between Pakistan and India without the prior resolution of the Kashmir dispute. I think most Pakistani civilians understand that Pakistan has a serious economic and social crisis which requires normalization with India. But the military as an institution still thinks of India as an existential threat to Pakistan, and so their attitude on this subject would be very different from that of the civilians.
Which means that the army's attitude is until and unless the Kashmir issue is resolved, and presumably resolved to Pakistan's satisfaction, and that means the army's satisfaction, improvement of relations with India is out of the question.
It will only be cyclical. It will be small steps, baby steps, 2 steps forward, 1.5 backward.
What about Nawaz Sharif? There is a view in India, and it seems to be gaining currency, that Mr. Sharif is sincere about A, wanting to improve the relationship with India, and B, about genuinely tackling India's concern about terror that emanates from Pakistan. Are Indians correct in that belief, or are they mistaken?
They're not mistaken. Mr. Nawaz Sharif is, after all, an elected leader. He needs the votes of the people. He realizes the magnitude of Pakistan's problems. Look, Pakistan has the 8th largest military in the world, yet it only has the 42nd largest economy. Now that gap will catch up. Pakistan is lagging behind in most indicators of social, human and economic development. And in that environment, Pakistan needs peace before anything else.
Which is why Mr. Nawaz Sharif is sincere, because the one great factor that will bring peace and possibly also reduce the army's hold on the Pakistan economy is improving the relationship with India.
Absolutely, and it will free Pakistan to actually grow economically. Look, 42% of our school-going age children between the age of 5 and 15 do not go to school. Now that is something that needs to be addressed, but it cannot be addressed if Pakistan is a garrison state and it's a country where militancy and the military reign supreme.
Which of course is why the army doesn't want the improvement of relationship with India swiftly and quickly, because the army will lose out. They will lose their control over the budget. They will lose their importance in the running of Pakistan.
Look, don't get me wrong. An army is something that every country needs, and Pakistan needs a strong army. However, what needs to be done is that army has to be part of the greater paradigm of what is in the interest of the nation collectively. Putting 42% children who are out of school into school is as important for Pakistan as it is to safeguard its frontiers.
Let me ask you a couple of questions more about Pathankot and the handling of Pathankot, and in particular Pakistan's response to it, before I broaden our discussion. I want to ask you how you, as a man who has viewed your government in operation for decades, views the way Pakistan has responded to Pathankot. To begin with, there were several meetings between the Prime Minister, the ISI chief and the army chief. Then a special investigation team, a joint investigation team has been set up comprising military intelligence, the ISI and the Intelligence Bureau. There have been arrests, there have been raids, offices have been sealed. And now the Pakistan government says it wants to send a special investigative team to Pathankot. Taken together, does this suggest significant steps? Or are we in India being misled by the detail of information without really understanding whether this is substantive or cosmetic?
Look, on the micro picture, this is important. These are steps that needed to be taken, and I'm so glad that Pakistan's government has been able to take those steps. That said, the big picture is whether these will just be baby steps and then there will be nothing further.
What's your hunch?
My hunch is that it will be the latter, that this will not really lead to a conclusive crackdown. And I have reasons for that. Let me explain them. Soon after Mumbai, if you remember, the civilian government first announced that the DGISI will travel to India and will talk about this matter. Then that was diluted. Then we had a national security advisor at that time who was fired because he acknowledged that the attackers were from Pakistan at a time when our intelligence services were telling the journalists that they weren't Pakistani. Although there was overwhelming evidence and their families had come forward that they are Pakistani. They were proud of their children for having done what they did in Mumbai, unfortunately. So after that, there was a joint investigation, and there was a team from Pakistan that came here. The head of that team wrote in Dawn newspaper not long ago that most of the evidence that was provided to us by India
You're talking
was
about
correct.
Tariq Khosa.
Absolutely. Mr. Khosa wrote a very good article in which he said the evidence was there. Then a political issue was created that evidence from India cannot be accepted because it's tainted, because India is our enemy.
And you're saying that the same thing that happened in 2008, a good beginning which then whittled down to nothing, will happen again?
It could happen again. I never say will, because I really am not a soothsayer, I'm an analyst.
This time round, we know for a fact that Secretary of State Kerry rang up Nawaz Sharif to encourage him to act effectively and promptly, and a couple of days later Pakistan did begin to act. Do you think Pakistan's response, which has been taken to be more effective by the Indian government this time around, has been welcomed formally today by the Foreign Office spokesperson, is a result of that phone call from Kerry? And secondly, do you think the appearance or the belief that the army is supporting what the civilian government is doing is also because of Kerry?
Look, I can only tell from experience. I was ambassador at the time of Mumbai. I was Pakistan's ambassador to the United States, and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice immediately asked me to come over and see her, and she basically shared some of the issues and said, you have to tell your government to act on it. We did see action after that.
So she stepped in as Secretary of State and actually specifically said to you as Pakistan ambassador, you have to act, and you have to act quickly.
Asked me to convey the message to my government that you have to act. Then the Central Intelligence Agency shared information with us, gave the names of people like Mr. Lakhvi, etc., which they had tracked through the NSA surveillance. So my point is that an American role in trying to tell Pakistan to act and telling India to remain a little calm is not something new either. It has happened before. Pakistan has to actually start very clearly giving the signal that the jihadists are not going to be tolerated. We are not seeing that. Even in the last 24 hours, I don't know if you've seen Pakistani television channels, there are some people who've already started casting doubt on the story about Pathankot. There are many people who say that Indians do a lot of false flag attacks just to blame Pakistan. Things like that are not conducive to the kind of honest dialogue that is needed between these two countries, and that's why I remain cautiously optimistic but extremely skeptical.
But would you also go one step further and say that pressure from America, from Kerry and Obama, needs to be kept up to ensure that after what looks like, to many in India at any rate, as a good start by Pakistan, it doesn't fizzle out as 2008 fizzled out?
Well, Pakistan actually needs to rise to a position where it should be acting not because of anybody's pressure. It's in Pakistan's interest to eliminate all terrorist groups. It's in Pakistan's interest to normalize relations with India. It's in Pakistan's interest to have economic growth, move forward rather than going round and round in circles.
A final question on Pathankot. Assuming that in fact the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif had to use up a certain amount of political capital to get the army and the ISI on board for whatever steps he's taken, and in particular assuming he needed them for the action he has taken against Masood Azhar, does the fact that the Foreign Secretary talks have been postponed embarrass him? Will it weaken his position vis-a-vis the army chief?
I think your Indian leaders have taken a sensible position on this. They have not postponed the talks amid any kind of sort of raucous statements on the side. Everybody, including people from the BJP.
That will help Nawaz Sharif.
That will help Nawaz Sharif. And I think there is an effort by your elected leaders, India's elected leaders, to try and be supportive and sympathetic to Pakistan's elected leaders. And that is a good thing. That said, it may not necessarily work. There will be people who will turn that to Mr. Sharif's disadvantage, and they will say Nawaz Sharif has become an Indian agent, or he's pursuing India's interest. It is very difficult in the current environment in Pakistan to actually take a position different from what has become the national narrative and say, I also want Pakistan's national interest to be protected, but what I consider to be Pakistan's national interest is different from what several military dictators have made into Pakistan's national interest.
So what you're saying is, on this critical question, will the postponement, even a short postponement, affect and damage Nawaz Sharif vis-a-vis the army? The jury is still out.
It is definitely out. I really am one of those who's rooting for Mr. Sharif. I will root for any other civilian prime minister as well. Look, in the modern world, every country has military prowess, but even then, you need civilians who can actually control strategic direction, because war, as Clemenceau said, is very serious business to be left only to generals.
Let's take a break at that point, Mr. Haqqani. When I come back, I want to broaden the discussion and talk to you a little bit about Pakistani politics, the broader nature of the relationship between the army and the civilian government post the dharnas of 2014, but also a little bit about the PPP and how it's faring, Imran Khan, and whether he's fizzled out and suddenly hit a very bad patch. We'll be back in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back. You're watching To The Point, and my guest is Pakistan's former ambassador to the United States, an author who's written extensively on civil-military relations in his country and is now a director with the Hudson Institute in Washington, Hussain Haqqani. Mr. Haqqani, let's widen our discussion. After the 4 or 5 month-long dharna staged in 2014 by Imran Khan and Tahirul Qadri, the view in India is that Nawaz Sharif ended up a weakened prime minister, that he lost control of Pakistan's US and India policy, as well as its national security policies, to the army and in particular to General Raheel Sharif. Is the present Pakistani government considerably weaker than earlier civilian governments?
I don't think so. I think this government is reasonably strong. And by the way, the previous civilian government wasn't that weak either. The problem is that politicians also have to worry about sort of national opinion and public opinion. And in Pakistan, the media often plays the role of supporting the Pakistani establishment in influencing the decisions of the civilians. The dharnas weakened Mr. Nawaz Sharif only briefly. After that, he has been able to assert himself. Remember, General Raheel Sharif's tenure comes to an end in November this year. That means there will be an opportunity for Nawaz Sharif to appoint a new army chief, and that makes the army less likely to do anything to the Prime Minister before the appointment of a new chief.
This is very interesting. You're actually saying that the view that's widely held in India that Nawaz Sharif is the weakened man is mistaken. Number two, you're saying that Nawaz Sharif actually has a very important lever over General Raheel Sharif. The fact that Raheel Sharif's tenure ends and Nawaz Sharif will either decide whether to extend it, which is what happened to Kayani under Asif Zardari, or to appoint a new man, and that gives Nawaz Sharif a trump in his hand.
Which is why you see the equation between them slightly differently. The army does have influence over foreign policy and national security policy. It does control several levers of power, but at the same time, Mr. Nawaz Sharif is not out by any account.
And is Nawaz Sharif increasingly using his advantages to ensure that there is a certain deference from the army chief and the ISI chief to the civilian prime minister? Is he using it successfully, in fact?
We'll take a long time to get there. We have a very different history, for example, than yours. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had actually conducted a study on civil-military relations between 1945 and 47. And after that, they made sure that the Ministry of Defense and the civilians in it control the military rather than the army. We've had 4 coups. We have had several palace coups. General Raheel Sharif has shown himself to be a much more honorable soldier than many others in the past. That said, there are institutional constraints, even if he wants this to be a decision that is made by the civilians. And then the civilians have to perform, Karan. Look, if the government loses popularity because the economy is not good or law and order is not good, then, of course, that plays into the hands of the army.
Now, paradoxically, and this is the other side of the picture, many people, both in India and abroad, believe that Pakistan's hand internationally has actually considerably and significantly strengthened over the last 1 year. Your relations with China, with America and Russia, for a variety of different reasons, have significantly improved. Your economy is performing creditably. You're growing at something like 4.5% a year. Are people in India, you get the feeling, perhaps unaware of the fact that Pakistan's hand is stronger than it was a year ago?
Well, let us say that it is stronger than immediately before, but it's not strong in an inherent sense. Pakistan has, for example, one of the worst tax to GDP ratios. We are highly indebted right now. In fact, our loans from the International Monetary Fund, international institutions, and even private banks have really ballooned. And under such circumstances, this is a reprieve, but not necessarily a turning around. It's not a turnaround by any chance.
What about the PPP, a party with which you were associated? They appointed you as ambassador to America. At the moment, Asif Zardari is abroad and no one knows when he's going to come back. The party seems to be in the charge of Bilawal Bhutto, who is both young and inexperienced. Hence my question, how is PPP faring?
Well, the PPP is strong in its base in Sindh. It has regained ground in southern Punjab. Hopefully, by the time of the next election, the party will be in good form to compete. The good thing about democracy, Karan, is that those who are popular one day are not necessarily destined to be popular the next. Otherwise, there would be no point in having elections after 5 years or 4 years. So the PPP lost one election doesn't mean it will lose all others that come in the future. And I think Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, people should give some credit to, that he does connect with the people a lot better than his father did.
Do you think Bilawal Bhutto has the capacity and he has the talent to take the PPP back to power?
Well, he definitely has political skills and he has been able to energize party members and the party base. Now, the PPP needs fresh blood all over. There are certain people who have been in the party leadership for decades. And in Sindh, for example, the chief minister is well into his 70s. We need younger leaders in the party. But look, the PPP is the only left-of-center party in Pakistan with a national appeal. The ANP is the other. So, which with a very limited appeal in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. In that sense, eventually when the pendulum swings a little bit more, the PPP will be able to play some role.
And Bilawal Bhutto, like his mother did previously in earlier elections, will be able to galvanize popular support around himself and what he stands for.
Look, ideally, of course, I'm sure you and I and everybody else who's been to college and thinks of democracy as a system whereby leaders are changed regularly, we would like all our countries not to have anybody who is there just by virtue of their family legacy. But that said, in Pakistan, I think Bilawal Bhutto Zardari does have a much better future than some people give him credit for outside of Pakistan.
What about Imran Khan? At the time of the 2013 elections, he'd boasted that he was going to sweep the polls. He ended up coming third. In 2014, when the dharnas were being staged in Islamabad, many people believed that he would topple the government. The dharnas instead fizzled out. Last year, when local body elections were held, he did really rather poorly. Is he slowly but steadily sliding downwards, or is that just a misleading impression?
Well, first of all, Imran Khan is a celebrity. He's a former cricket player, he's a former cricket star. Until General Pasha of the ISI put his weight behind him and asked several politicians to join the party, he was a lone ranger. He will always be in the news. He will always be a good interview for people like you. He's a charming guy. He, however, lacks the political strength that is needed to be able to right to power through popular support. He often opens his mouth and puts his foot into it, and how he manages to do that, I'm sure, is something for all of us to try and investigate and examine.
You began that answer with a very intriguing comment. Until General Pasha convinced several politicians to join him, Imran Khan was a virtual non-entity in political terms. Many suspected during the 2014 dharna that he was actually a cat's paw for the Pakistan army. Is he? Is he a sort of civilian front they've chosen through which they can exercise power, as many thought and believed in 2014?
Well, look, let us just say that he has been open to persuasion by anybody and everybody. His party is in power in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa right now in a coalition with Jamaat-e-Islami. So the Imran Khan you probably knew at Oxford and the Jamaat-e-Islami being in bed together, not necessarily literally but metaphorically, should amuse you. But he has done that. I wouldn't be surprised if he thinks that he could topple the government with the help of individuals who are probably retired military officers trying to tell him that the military is behind them. The military didn't act, and that is a positive thing.
You're talking about the contradictions in his positions and his beliefs. People also talk about the U-turns that he's undertaken both before and now. As a result, social media refers to him in Pakistan as U-turn Khan. Has his popular standing amongst the young, when he was supposedly leading 100,000-man marches, diminished hugely in the last 2-3 years?
I don't think that the size of the marches is going to shrink. There will always be young women and young men who would like to go and see the great Khan. He did do a very good deed in building hospital in the memory of his mother, Pakistan's first cancer hospital. So he does have those attractions. Problem is, in parliamentary democracy, you have to have a base other than just a few young people who will show up at marches and demonstrations.
And that he doesn't have.
And he just doesn't have it, because even in the last election, with everybody thinking that he's about to sweep to power, his party only managed 35 seats in parliament.
Finally, and very quickly, what about Pakistan's relationship with America, which many would say is perhaps the most critical relationship the country has? You've been, as I said earlier, ambassador to America. You're also a director of the Hudson Institute. How does the Obama administration today view Pakistan?
The Obama administration just wants to get through its term without having to deal with another major India-Pakistan crisis or another Pakistan crisis. They would like to have some kind of a solution to Afghanistan that they can claim victory. So therefore, they want to approach Pakistan rather cautiously. Pakistan's most critical relationships in the past have been China, which has been its military backer, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. Things are not that good with Saudi Arabia right now. They're disappointed because they feel Pakistan did not keep its word of being able to support them in any military situation, and they assume that that would mean even if it is outside of Saudi territory. Pakistan has taken the position, we'll defend your kingdom, but we will not go outside your kingdom to attack. And while that position is definitely quite widely supported in Pakistan, it's not a position that's popular in Saudi Arabia. So the United States would like to maintain good relations with Pakistan, but it also wants Pakistan to change. And when that change does not come about, we will see a second cycle of frustration on the part of the Americans.
Very, very quickly, is there a difference between the way the Obama administration and the US Congress, which is now largely in Republican hands, views Pakistan?
No, I think President Obama also has very skeptical views of Pakistan. That's why in his State of the Union address, he actually mentioned Pakistan in
as a possible haven for future terrorists.
As a possible haven for future terrorists. And I know how President Obama's mind works. I've met him many times as ambassador. I can tell you one thing, he measures his words very carefully. He wouldn't have put that in his address, State of the Union address, if he did not mean it. That said, President Obama has shrunk American involvement all over the world. He has reduced American footprint, and he believes that America needs this calmer period after 2 wars. I don't agree with him, but that does not mean that that is not his policy. And so they do not want a new front in rocking the apple cart or whatever the expression is. He will definitely maintain the relationship, but Congress is going to be far more proactive in restricting aid, support, etc. to Pakistan.
Very, very quickly, literally almost in a sentence, if Congress does, as some newspaper reports suggest, stall or block the sale of promised F-16 aircrafts to Pakistan, what impact will that have?
Well, it will have a psychological impact, although of course in Pakistan it will be seen as another example of America being a fair weather friend. But as I keep telling my countrymen, it's time for them to get out of the state of denial we've created for ourselves and understand the realities of the modern world.
Mr. Haqqani, a pleasure talking to you.
Such a pleasure being here.